Thanks, Dietram. It's great to be here this morning. I think I first talked to Barbara Klein-Pope of the National Academies about this Sackler maybe 2 years ago. So it's amazing to see such a sensational turnout. I'm looking forward to the Sackler in 2013. I also want to acknowledge a former student of mine, John Kotter, who's a communication officer here. He played a key role in helping organize this symposium, and he'll be starting his PhD in science communication at George Mason in the fall with Ed Maybach. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the research related to media and science policy debates. And in doing so, I'm going to try to break out of the proverbial nerd loop, as Randy Olson and Andrew Repkin is over here, while also trying to give a fair overview of a lot of different research in this area. And on Twitter at ageofengagement.com, you can let me know how I'm doing. Also, I posted references in a reading list related to the major topics I'm covering at my blog, Age of Engagement. If you just Google Age of Engagement, you can find the reading list there. And most of the readings are freely available online. Okay, so the media has several important influences on the judgments and the decisions, not just of different segments of the public, but also of the expert community, including scientists, policymakers, NGOs, and journalists. And one of the key ways that the media influences judgments and decisions is through calling attention to some issues over others, making some issues more salient for the public and decision makers over others. We know from a lot of research in this media agenda setting influence, as an issue rises on the media agenda, it also tends then to follow and rise on the public agenda. And if it rises enough on the public agenda, an issue becomes perceived as a more important problem and also as a national priority. And when that happens, the issues that are receiving the greatest amount of attention from the media become the criteria by which the public and others judge the performance of the president, of Congress, and of other major institutions, including the scientific community. Another key way that the media influences judgments and decisions is by setting the frame of reference or context on an issue. When it does this, the media often conveys why an issue might be personally, socially, or politically relevant, and also sets in motion attributions about why an issue might be a problem, who or what is responsible, and what should be done. So at the second half of my presentation, I'm going to come back talking about some of these influences, and the other panelists are going to be discussing these in more detail as well. But I'm going to start, though, first in looking at research on what accounts for the factors that drive media attention and how the media frames these issues. And in communication research, we call this process the agenda building and frame building process. Now, this graph is probably familiar to many of you. This looks at attention at the national trend-setting newspapers to climate change over time, as compiled by Max Boykoff at the University of Colorado. And what you see in this pattern of attention is a classic issue attention cycle. Across social problems and across science issues, we see this up and down cycle of attention. And these spikes in attention are often around key political moments or political decisions. But when we evaluate the performance of the media, we often find fault with this natural pattern. We assume that media attention should follow and correlate with the objective conditions around an issue. We often criticize the media. We think that the media should be almost following a linear path in terms of media attention, following directly the release of new scientific information and studies and the increasing number of climate change impacts that happen on climate change. But the media just doesn't work that way. And to be successful communicators, we need to understand that, and we need to have an understanding of the factors that account for this issue attention cycle as a way to anticipate them and also as a way to influence them. Now, this is a diagram that sort of represents a lot of research over the last 20 years across several different types of disciplines that have tried to understand the mechanisms driving these patterns in attention. And we've arrived at a couple different key conclusions. Issues like climate change and stem cell research will go for years, decades, in a state of non-attention until a focusing event or series of focusing events, such as James Hansen's testimony before Congress in 1988, the extraction of human stem cells from human embryos in 1998, suddenly bounces this issue from non-attention into broader public debate. And what usually happens is that with these focusing events, the political relevance of the issue is magnified and the dramatic potential of the issue is magnified. And a number of different stakeholder groups then start to lobby the media because they realize that controlling attention to an issue while also framing it will strongly influence policy outcomes. And when this happens, we start to see a change in discourse from more technical considerations and frames of reference that might focus on scientific background and thematic discussion of policy frameworks to more dramatic discourse. More dramatic discourse in terms of often exaggerated claims about risks, benefits, values, ethics, and a heavy focus on strategy and conflict. And as groups are lobbying the media, many groups will also look to try to switch the policy venue where debate is taking place. Many groups might feel that administrative arenas like the NIH or the EPA don't favor their interests, so they try to shift in debate from these arenas to Congress and the White House. And as this happens, not only is this correlated with an increase in dramatic claims, but also we start to see then attention and coverage from political reporters, opinion writers, and political bloggers. And as these members of the media and the discourse community start to pay attention to the issue, it adds to the general baseline of coverage from science reporters, environmental reporters, other specialist journalists, and the bloggers who are blogging in the environment and science space. And this is in part why we see this surge and spike in attention to the issue. And this rising attention often leads up to some type of key decision on the horizon. It could be a vote on legislation. It could be a decision by the White House. And once that decision is made or not made, often what happens is the dramatic qualities of the issue are lessened. The media lobbying activities of stakeholders decline. And this is when you see then a downturn in media attention. Dramatic discourse shifts more back towards technical discourse, focusing on science and policy frameworks. You see that political reporters and opinion writers and political bloggers are no longer see the issue as relevant to their beat. And we have a transfer to attention mostly from the specialized beats. And these overtly political arenas delegate decision-making then back to places like the NIH and the EPA until this cycle starts over again with a focusing event and media lobbying leading up to some other type of key political decision. Okay, so let's take a look at how this worked in the stem cell debate in the early part of the 2000s. This is data from a series of studies. One of the studies I published with Dominique, they were published in 2003, 2005, and 2006. You can find links on my blog. And in the upper right-hand corner here, what you see is this pattern in spikes in attention at the New York Times and Washington Post. They're two trend-setting newspapers. This first spike is in 2001 with Bush's compromised position on stem cell research, and the second spike is leading up to the 2004 election. And during this time, what you see is, in terms of overall coverage, a decline in the prominence of frames of reference around technical, more thematic considerations. In this case, in terms of scientific background and the release of new scientific studies. At the same time, while the issue is climbing the media agenda, you see a major increase then in emphasis on more dramatic discourse. In particular, a focus in the yellow line on a focus on political strategy and conflict. This is what political reporters trade in. They cover the stem cell debate just like they would cover the healthcare debate or an election. Who's ahead, who's behind, and how does this play politically? And in the blue line, you also see a rising frame of reference around ethics and values, often exaggerated claims around moral benefits and moral risks of the research. And why is this important from science and communication? Because this is important as on many of these issues, when the issue of stem cell research rises in the media agenda, it comes into public focus maybe for the first time. The focus is not on more technical considerations around science and policy frameworks, but often around dramatic claims related to risk, benefit, costs, political strategy, and conflict. And we see this same type of pattern happening on climate change. This is from a report that I released last year that you can find at climateshiftproject.org. And during the months of 2009, what you see is this rising level of media attention leading up to this major international summit, this major dramatic moments where the world's leaders would gather. There's a lot of media lobbying activity happening, and there's also debate about the bill on cap and trade in the House. You see increased attention from political reporters and opinion writers, and then the Copenhagen meetings happen. And the Copenhagen meetings, for the most part, were perceived or at least framed as not successful. What happens then? The dramatic potential of the issue is lost. For political writers and opinion writers, they no longer see the issue as relevant to their beat. And you see then a major decline then in media attention, and coverage and discussion moves back to science writers, environmental reporters, science bloggers, environmental bloggers, et cetera, even though a bill was being debated in the Senate that eventually passed or voted on. Okay, the other way that we evaluate the media, especially when there's these spikes in attention and we have a lot of discussion and coverage from political reporters, is we have a heavy focus on whether or not the media is engaging in false balance. Well, for a number of different reasons, we need to be careful with how we think about and talk about false balance. For one reason, across a number of different studies, we know that the more partisan a person might be, and also the more committed they might be to an issue in terms of action, the more likely they are to view even objectively favorable coverage as hostile to their interest or biased against their position. And that's why we can't rely on anecdotal observation to make judgments about false balance, even though we do it all the time. Instead, we need to rely on research tools like content analysis, and in doing so, when we measure false balance, we need an objective standard by which to evaluate balance. And on climate change, there is an objective standard, and that's on the fundamentals of climate science. Is climate change happening, and is it real? On other dimensions of climate change, it's more difficult to systematically evaluate false balance. So for example, on the connection between climate change and extreme weather, journalists are justified in featuring a greater diversity of voices. On policy debates, such as is cap and trade likely be an effective policy, again, they should focus on the diversity of voices. So in discussion of false balance, the study that's most often cited and talked about is Max Boykoff and Jules Boykoff's study from 2004 that looked at media coverage of the trend-setting newspapers up through 1992. And what they found in this study, and this study was also talked about by Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth, was only about 35% of coverage up through 2002 reflected the consensus view on the fundamentals of climate science. Is climate change happening? Is it human caused? And about half of coverage, a little more than half of coverage, engaged in false balance. Now, this balances bias thesis by Boykoff is often still discussed at scientific meetings in the blogosphere. Few people have probably, however, read Boykoff's 2007 study titled Flogging a Dead Norm. And what he did in that study is he looked at coverage between 2003 and 2006. And what he found at these same trend-setting newspapers is that by 2006, false balance on the fundamentals of climate science had virtually disappeared, where 97% of coverage by 2006 features the consensus view on this topic. So in the report that I released last year, I looked at, again, coverage working closely with Max to apply his methodology, and looking at coverage in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Politico, and CNN.com. Across these months of 2009 and 2010, at least 7 out of 10 news articles and opinion articles reflected the consensus view on climate science. You can see some divergence in and around Copenhagen there where you see that major spike in attention. But most of that divergence is from the Wall Street Journal. That's part of the sample. Not from the news reporting at the Wall Street Journal, but rather from the opinion and editorial page, where you have only about half of discussion of the editorial page reflects the consensus view on climate change. Now, the findings from the Wall Street Journal are consistent with a lot of other studies that have looked at News Corporation-owned media organizations across the globe, finding that News Corporation-owned media organizations tend to challenge consensus views on climate change. And one of those studies was conducted by my colleague at American University, published last year, Lauren Feldman, along with Ed Maybach and Tony Laserowitz, who we'll be hearing from later today. And they looked at program hours at CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. And what they found, and Miles O'Brien, if he's still here, this is for you, what they found at CNN and MSNBC was that more than 70% of program hours that had a substantive discussion of climate change reflected the consensus view in the need for action. In contrast, though, at Fox News, nearly 60% of program hours that discuss climate change challenge consensus view and the need for action. And Fox News also had more frequent discussion of the issue than the other cable news networks. Now, discussion of the Fox News content then brings us back then to focusing on audience effects. And one of the things that has happened, especially over the last 10 years in the United States, and Dietram talked about this in his presentation yesterday, is that this is a natural feature of human judgment and decision and opinion formation, that we rely on our predispositions, our values, our political identity as information shortcuts to make up our minds about complex issues, whether it's stem cell research, the healthcare debate, who to vote for in an election, or an issue like climate change. But over the last 10 years, as our country has become more polarized and as Republican and Democratic leaders have pulled apart ideologically, what you see is a growing number of contrasting elite cues on these complex policy debates. And you see a gap in perceptions and support between Republicans and Democrats. And often these gaps are greatest among the highly educated. Why? Because the highly educated tend to be heavier news consumers. They're better at recognizing partisan cues, and they're more likely to react to those partisan cues in ideologically consistent ways. And Feldman and her colleagues, they look at this process in their own study, looking at the influence of Fox News in a regression analysis, trying to control for a number of different confounds. They look at the difference between lighter viewing Republicans and heavier viewing Republicans, and sure enough, they find a correlation where Fox News appears to reinforce or shape the views of heavier viewers in the Republicans in the direction of more dismissiveness on the issue of climate change. But we shouldn't, as Dietram talked about, we shouldn't assume that these types of processes are unique just to the public. It also happens among policymakers and also the expert community. We're going to selectively attend to issues and selectively perceive them, relying on different types of political shortcuts and also cues in the media. Now, most of us probably paid close attention to coverage of the Bush administration's interference in government scientists. In a survey that Pew did, a survey sample of AAAS members in the public, they found that by 2009, however, only 10% of the public said that they had paid close attention or had heard a lot about the issue, compared to 55% of AAAS members. But within the sample of AAAS members displayed in the larger graph, and these bubbles are proportionate to political identity, what you see is not only selective attention, but probably selective information seeking on the topic. So 75% of strong liberals said that they heard a lot about the claims, compared to 63% of liberals, 47% of moderates, almost 30-point difference, and only 27% of conservatives. This suggests not only selective attention, but selective information seeking by way of things like blogs, social media, and Google searching. And within the AAAS members, few of whom are actually working climate scientists, we see that ideology, political predisposition, also influences even their judgments about the issue of climate change. So we see that among strong liberals, 95% of AAAS members say that the Earth is getting warmer due to human activities, compared to 80% of moderates and only 44% of conservatives. And also it influences their perceptions and judgments about the seriousness of the issue. Here we see even the difference between strong liberals and moderates of more than 25 percentage points in terms of perceived seriousness. Now, importantly, these predispositions and these factors are real. But what's happened now over the last couple of years is that discussion of ideological differences in views of science, as reflected in poll results, has unfortunately come to dominate popular debates over science communication and public engagement. It seems that we've moved from a knowledge deficit model that blames science illiteracy for breakdowns in communication to a new ideological deficit model that blames conservative psychology and conservative media. The danger here is that we start to think about the public in exclusively binary terms, as conservatives versus liberals, as deniers versus believers. And as science communicators, we have to work hard to break out of that mental box, even though it might appeal to our own political identity and ideology. So a great methodology for doing this, one pioneered by Ed and Tony, who you'll hear from later today, is the 6 Americas of global warming surveys. This is audience segmentation research based on research and methodology developed in public health, and they ask people roughly 40 questions about their attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and preferences on climate change. And we start to look at the public this way. What we start to see is our binary box is challenged. We often talk about these ideological poles, but they only really make up about 25% of the public. The reality is in between, you have about 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans who are on a continuum from concerned to doubtful, and a continuum of relative amounts of ambivalence. So from a communication standpoint, we spend a huge amount of time trying to figure out how to respond to deniers. And in doing so, we spend a lot of resources. But we often end up only communicating with ourselves and reaching the alarm. From a communication standpoint, we have to figure out the best way to try to engage this ambivalent middle. Now consider for a moment, if we switch the frame of reference on climate change from a traditional frame of reference that focused on environmental impacts, and this was the dominant frame of reference through 2006 and 2007. Notice what's missing from these images. Pictures of people, right? The images, the impacts are happening in remote polar regions. The iconic victims are polar bears and penguins. Imagine if we switched the frame of reference where we put people in the middle of our story about climate change, consistent with the research focusing on the public health risks of climate change and the need to defend and protect people and communities from impacts. Talking about the relationship to childhood asthma, allergies, vulnerability to heat waves, infectious disease, but doing so in a way that we don't over-dramatize the issue, as I think this Discover magazine cover does in talking about the coming plague. So in research that Ed and I have been doing along with Tony and others, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we've been looking at what happens when you reset the frame of reference on climate change away from environmental impacts to focusing on public health. Our first study, we went to the National Mall. As people walked by, we asked them to fill out a 15-item questionnaire that placed people validly into one of the 6 audience segments on climate change. And then if they're willing to participate, we went around the corner to the Hirshhorn Museum. This is Ed conducting an in-depth interview with one of the subjects, where we talked to them for about 45 minutes about their attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Few of the subjects, of the 70 subjects that we interviewed, mentioned public health impacts as of 2009 when this was done. It was just not a relevant or available frame of reference for them. But at the end of the interview, we then gave them an essay, and I don't expect you to be able to read this essay. But this is an example of the essay that we gave them, or the essay that we actually gave them. In the beginning of this essay, it opens by talking about the health risks of climate change. And then importantly, at the end, what it does is it localizes the issue by talking about mitigation-related actions, such as improving accessibility to public transportation and energy efficiency, and pairs those actions to public health benefits. And as people read across the essay, we asked them to mark anything in pink that was especially confusing or not understandable or compelling, and anything in green that was especially useful and compelling. And then for each sentence in the essay, we computed the difference between the number of times it's marked in green, the number of times it's marked in red. And here you can see for the 3 audience segments that are in the direction of ambivalence, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive, as they read across the essay, they naturally started to counter-argue against the information, even when it was posed in terms of health risks. But at the end of the essay, when we localized the issue, focusing on mitigation-related actions, and paired those actions with public health benefits, the reaction to the essay goes way up in the positive direction, towards finding that information useful and compelling. So from a public engagement and communication standpoint, thinking about the influence of the media, and this brings us back to agenda building and frame building. There's a lot of value in moving forward and trying to communicate about the health impacts of climate change and trying to localize the issue for people in order to increase participation and increase motivation to participate in decisions. But we still face this agenda building problem. This is looking at New York Times coverage over time. In the gray bars, you find that this is overall attention to climate change. And then in the red bars on the right-hand side of the axis, this is the number of stories mentioning public health impacts. Only 10% of public health of stories on climate change through 2009 mention public health. So if you Google conveying the human implications of climate change, you can find a report that Ed and I did talking about agenda building and frame building strategies. And I have 8 seconds. I'll talk more about this in the Q&A. But it's more than just agenda building and frame building. In the regional areas of our country, our regional newspapers have declined. And we also have to think about a new model for providing accountability and explanatory journalism. Else these regions lack the capacity and infrastructure to respond and participate in decisions about climate change and energy. Thank you.